Most errors are not born from ignorance, but from speed. The mind does not fail because it cannot see, but because it refuses to wait. Judgment rushes ahead of understanding, and in that instant, distortion begins. This is where discipline must intervene. The discipline of paused evaluation is the refusal to immediately agree with what appears. It is the space between perception and conclusion. In that space, control is reclaimed. What is seen is not yet truth. What is felt is not yet fact. The undisciplined mind collapses these steps into one: see, react, believe. But the trained mind separates them: see, pause, examine. To pause is not weakness. It is precision. It prevents the corruption of thought by impulse. Every impression demands a response, but not every response must be immediate. The one who delays judgment does not lose clarity, they protect it. The first failure of the mind is not that it judges, but that it judges instantly. The impression arrives, and without resistance, the conclusion follows. There is no separation, no inspection, no filter. This is not thinking. This is reflex. Every external event presents itself as something apparent, something that seems true. But appearance is not agreement. The error begins when the mind treats the first impression as final. A look becomes an accusation. A tone becomes an insult. A delay becomes rejection. None of these are facts. They are interpretations formed without discipline. The discipline of paused evaluation interrupts this chain. It inserts a barrier between what is perceived and what is accepted. This barrier is not emotional. It is structural. It forces the mind to recognize a simple distinction: this is what appears, this is not yet what is. Without this distinction, the mind becomes a servant to impressions. With it, the mind becomes sovereign. Consider how quickly anger forms. Someone speaks, and within a fraction of a second, the meaning is assigned, the intention is assumed, and the emotional reaction is triggered. But what actually happened? Words were heard. That is all. Everything else, the motive, the insult, the disrespect, was added by the mind. Not discovered. Added. The pause exposes this. It reveals that between stimulus and reaction, there is an unclaimed space. Most people never notice it because they move too quickly. But once seen, it cannot be unseen. In that space, a question emerges: is this impression accurate? This question is the beginning of discipline. Without it, the mind lives in a constant state of distortion. It reacts not to reality, but to its own interpretations of reality. And because these interpretations are formed instantly, they feel certain. Speed creates the illusion of truth. The faster the judgment, the more convincing it appears. But conviction is not correctness. The disciplined mind understands that immediacy is the enemy of accuracy. It does not trust the first conclusion, not because it assumes it is false, but because it recognizes that it is untested. The pause is not skepticism, it is verification. This changes everything. When the mind delays agreement, it gains the ability to examine. It can ask, what exactly was said? What exactly happened? What evidence supports this interpretation? What evidence contradicts it? These questions are impossible in a state of immediacy. They require stillness. And stillness requires control. The undisciplined mind cannot remain still. It is pulled forward by impulse, by emotion, by the urgency to resolve uncertainty. It wants closure, even if that closure is incorrect. The pause denies this urgency. It tolerates uncertainty long enough for clarity to form. This tolerance is not passive. It is active restraint. To pause is to resist the automatic movement of the mind. It is to hold the impression in suspension without collapsing it into belief. This requires effort, especially at first. The habit of immediate judgment is deeply ingrained. It has been reinforced through repetition, thousands of unchecked reactions forming a pattern that feels natural. But natural is not the same as correct. The discipline of paused evaluation retrains this pattern. It replaces speed with sequence. First, perception. Then, pause. Then, examination. Only after these steps does judgment occur. This sequence restores order to the mind. Without order, there is no clarity. Without clarity, there is no control. And without control, the mind is vulnerable to every external influence. It becomes reactive, unstable, and easily manipulated, not by others, but by its own unchecked interpretations. The pause prevents this vulnerability. It ensures that nothing is accepted without inspection. It enforces a standard: no impression earns belief without examination. This standard transforms perception from a passive process into an active one. Now the mind is no longer a surface where impressions land and settle. It becomes a gatekeeper. Every impression must pass through scrutiny before it is allowed to take form as belief. This is discipline, not in action, but in thought. And once this discipline is established, something unexpected happens. The mind becomes quieter. Not because there are fewer impressions, but because fewer of them are accepted. Noise is reduced not at the level of input, but at the level of agreement. This is the function of the pause, not to stop the world from presenting itself, but to stop the mind from surrendering to it. If the first movement of error is speed, the second is attachment. The mind does not merely form judgments quickly, it clings to them. Once an impression is accepted, it is no longer treated as a possibility, but as a fact. From that moment forward, the mind no longer examines, it defends. This is where distortion hardens. An initial interpretation, formed without pause, becomes the foundation for further thinking. Every new piece of information is filtered through it. Evidence that supports it is amplified. Evidence that contradicts it is ignored or reshaped. The mind is no longer searching for what is true, it is preserving what it has already decided. The discipline of paused evaluation does not end at the first delay. It extends into sustained non-attachment. To pause once is not enough if the conclusion that follows becomes rigid. The discipline requires that even after judgment is formed, it remains provisional, subject to revision, open to correction. Without this, the pause becomes a temporary interruption, not a structural change. Most people cannot maintain this state. They mistake judgment for certainty. The moment they arrive at a conclusion, they treat it as settled. But a conclusion is only as reliable as the process that produced it. If the process lacked examination, the conclusion carries that flaw forward. And yet, the mind resists revisiting it. Why? Because revision feels like loss. To question a judgment is to admit that it may be wrong. And the undisciplined mind equates being wrong with weakness. So instead of reevaluating, it reinforces. It builds layers of justification around the original impression, strengthening it not through truth, but through repetition. This is how error becomes identity. A person does not simply hold a belief, they become invested in it. Now, any challenge to that belief is perceived as a threat, not to the idea, but to the self. At this point, evaluation stops entirely. Defense replaces it. The pause prevents this escalation. By delaying initial agreement, it weakens the foundation upon which attachment forms. But more importantly, by maintaining distance from conclusions, it prevents the mind from merging with them. A judgment is treated as a tool, not as a possession. This distinction is critical. When a judgment is a tool, it can be adjusted, replaced, or discarded as needed. When it is a possession, it must be protected. The disciplined mind chooses utility over ownership. It asks not, "Is this mine?" but "Is this accurate?" This shift removes emotional investment from the process of evaluation. Without investment, there is no resistance to change. The mind can update itself freely, without friction. New information is not an intrusion, it is an opportunity to refine understanding. This keeps perception fluid and aligned with reality, rather than fixed and distorted by past assumptions. But this fluidity requires continuous effort. The impulse to settle, to finalize, to conclude, to be done, is persistent. The mind seeks stability, even at the cost of accuracy. It prefers a solid error over a shifting uncertainty. The discipline of paused evaluation rejects this preference. It accepts instability as the price of clarity. To hold a judgment lightly is to remain in a state of readiness, to adjust, to reconsider, to refine. This is not indecision. It is controlled openness. The difference lies in structure. Indecision is chaotic, driven by confusion. Controlled openness is deliberate, grounded in awareness that knowledge is always partial. No impression contains the whole. Every perception is limited by context, by perspective, by incomplete information. The disciplined mind accounts for this limitation. It does not expect certainty from fragments. It assembles understanding gradually, testing each piece before integrating it. This process is incompatible with haste and attachment. It requires the same pause, applied repeatedly, not just at the beginning, but throughout the entire cycle of thinking. Each new layer of interpretation is subjected to the same scrutiny as the first. Nothing is exempt. This creates a recursive discipline. The mind evaluates not only the world, but its own evaluations. It watches itself forming judgments and intervenes when necessary. This self-observation prevents drift, the gradual movement from examination into assumption. Without this, even a trained mind can regress. Habits return. Speed increases. Attachment forms. The structure collapses. That is why the discipline must be maintained continuously. It is not a one-time correction, but an ongoing control mechanism. And when maintained, it produces a distinct effect. The mind becomes resistant to certainty, not in the sense of rejecting truth, but in refusing premature closure. It remains alert, aware that what seems clear may still be incomplete. This vigilance protects against the second failure, the hardening of error into belief. The pause, then, is not only a delay of judgment. It is a safeguard against attachment. It ensures that even after the mind concludes, it does not become confined by its own conclusion. The third failure is subtle. Even when the mind learns to pause, and even when it avoids attachment, there remains a deeper vulnerability. It forgets to examine the source of the impression itself. It questions the conclusion, but not the origin. And so, distortion enters earlier, before evaluation even begins. Not all impressions are equal. Some arise from direct observation. Others are shaped by memory, bias, expectation, or prior conditioning. Two people witness the same event and receive entirely different impressions, not because reality differs, but because the lens differs. If the lens is distorted, then even a disciplined evaluation of the impression will produce flawed results. The discipline of paused evaluation must extend one level deeper. It must ask not only, is this interpretation accurate? But also, what produced this impression? Without this second question, the mind risks refining error instead of eliminating it. It becomes precise, but not correct. Consider how expectation alters perception. If the mind anticipates disrespect, it will detect it in neutral behavior. If it expects rejection, it will interpret silence as confirmation. The impression feels immediate and real, but it has been pre-shaped before the moment even occurred. The pause, if applied only after the impression is formed, arrives too late to detect this distortion. So the discipline expands. It begins to monitor patterns, recurring interpretations that appear across different situations. If the same type of conclusion emerges repeatedly, the question shifts: is the world consistently producing this pattern, or is the mind consistently projecting it? This is where responsibility returns inward. The undisciplined mind attributes all impressions to external causes. It assumes that what appears must come from what is. But the disciplined mind recognizes that appearance is a collaboration between the world and the observer. It does not blindly trust its own perception. This distrust is not cynical. It is diagnostic. It allows the mind to isolate variables, to separate what is observed from what is added. For example, a person does not respond to a message. The raw event is simple, no reply. But the impression may carry additional weight, disrespect, avoidance, dismissal. These additions do not come from the event. They come from interpretation shaped by prior experience. The pause must intercept this layering. It must strip the impression back to its minimal form, what is undeniably present. Everything beyond that is treated as provisional. This reduction is essential. Without it, the mind evaluates a mixture of fact and projection as if it were a single unit. And once mixed, they are difficult to separate. The disciplined mind refuses this mixture. It isolates the observable. It labels the inferred. It keeps them distinct. This creates clarity at the level of input, not just at the level of judgment. Now, evaluation operates on clean data, not contaminated impressions. But this requires vigilance. Because projection is automatic, the mind fills gaps instinctively. It completes incomplete information with familiar patterns. This is efficient, but not accurate. The discipline of paused evaluation slows this completion process. It allows gaps to remain open until sufficient evidence is available. This tolerance for incompleteness is critical. Most errors are born from the inability to leave something unresolved. The mind rushes to complete the picture, even if the pieces do not fit. The pause resists this. It permits partial understanding. It delays synthesis until clarity justifies it. At this stage, the discipline becomes multi-layered. First, it pauses before judgment. Second, it avoids attachment after judgment. Third, it examines the origin of the impression before judgment even begins. These layers reinforce each other. If the source is examined, the initial impression is cleaner. If the pause is applied, the interpretation is tested. If attachment is avoided, the conclusion remains flexible. Together, they form a closed system of control, each layer correcting the weaknesses of the others. Without the third layer, the system is incomplete. Because even a paused and non-attached mind can still operate on flawed inputs. It can calmly, carefully, and incorrectly interpret a distorted impression. And because the process feels disciplined, the error is harder to detect. That is the danger. Discipline without depth creates confidence without accuracy. The mind believes it is in control, while still being guided by unseen biases. The third layer removes this blind spot. It forces the mind to confront its own role in shaping perception. And once this is seen, a shift occurs. The mind becomes less certain of its immediate impressions, not weaker, but more precise. It no longer treats perception as passive reception, but as active construction. This awareness introduces caution at the earliest stage. Now, the pause begins even before the pause. The moment an impression forms, it is already under observation. Not accepted. Not rejected. Observed. Its origin, its components, its influences, all held in view before any movement toward judgment occurs. This is the full extension of the discipline. Not just delaying reaction. Not just loosening conclusions. But regulating perception at its source, so that what enters the mind is already filtered through awareness before it ever reaches belief. The fourth failure is not in perception, nor in attachment, nor even in the origin of impressions. It is in consistency. The mind may understand the discipline, may apply it in controlled conditions, may even execute it correctly for a time, but it does not sustain it. It applies the pause selectively. And selective discipline is indistinguishable from no discipline at all. The mind remains structured when calm, but abandons structure under pressure. When emotion intensifies, the sequence collapses. Perception accelerates. The pause disappears. Judgment returns to immediacy. What was once filtered is now accepted without resistance. This inconsistency exposes the true weakness, not ignorance, but instability. The discipline of paused evaluation is not tested when the mind is undisturbed. It is tested at the point of disruption. When something unexpected occurs. When something threatens, provokes, or unsettles. In these moments, the impulse to react is strongest, and the capacity to pause is weakest. This is where the discipline must hold. But for most, it does not. Because the pause has been treated as a technique, not as a condition. It is applied when convenient, when there is time, when the stakes are low. But under pressure, the mind defaults to its original pattern: speed, assumption, reaction. This reveals a critical error in training. The discipline has not been integrated. It has been practiced in isolation, not embedded into the structure of thinking. It exists as an optional step, not as a required one. And anything optional will be abandoned when urgency increases. To correct this, the pause must become automatic. Not in the sense of being unconscious, but in the sense of being unavoidable. Just as the undisciplined mind cannot avoid reacting, the disciplined mind must not be able to avoid pausing. The sequence must be fixed. Perception cannot proceed directly to judgment under any condition. This requires repetition beyond comfort. The pause must be applied not only in significant moments, but in trivial ones. In minor interactions. In low-stakes situations. Because it is in these moments that the pattern is reinforced. Waiting for intensity to train discipline ensures failure. Under pressure, the mind does not rise to the level of its intentions, it falls to the level of its conditioning. So the conditioning must change. Every impression, regardless of importance, is subjected to the same process. See. Pause. Examine. This repetition builds a uniform response. It removes variability. Now, when disruption occurs, the mind does not need to decide whether to pause, it has no alternative. This is consistency. And consistency produces reliability. A reliable mind does not fluctuate based on circumstance. It does not become precise only when convenient. It maintains structure regardless of external conditions. This stability is what allows the discipline to function when it is most needed. Without it, the entire system collapses at the point of stress. But consistency introduces another requirement: endurance. The pause is not a one-time act. It is continuous. Every impression demands it. There is no completion point, no final mastery after which the discipline can be relaxed. The moment it is relaxed, the old pattern begins to reassert itself. This creates a sustained tension. The mind must remain alert, continuously intercepting impressions before they convert into judgments. This is effortful. It requires attention that does not drift, awareness that does not lapse. And because of this, fatigue becomes a factor. The undisciplined mind uses this fatigue as justification to abandon the process. It seeks efficiency, and the fastest path is always immediate judgment. The pause is seen as an obstacle, a delay, a burden. But this is a miscalculation. What appears efficient in the moment produces cumulative error. Each unchecked impression introduces distortion, and these distortions compound. The mind becomes increasingly misaligned, requiring greater correction later. The temporary ease of skipping the pause results in long-term instability. The disciplined mind recognizes this trade-off. It accepts the immediate cost of effort in exchange for sustained clarity. It does not measure efficiency by speed, but by accuracy over time. The pause, though slower in the moment, prevents the accumulation of error. This makes the entire system more stable, more predictable, and ultimately more effective. Consistency, then, is not merely repetition, it is protection. It ensures that the discipline is present not only in theory, but in every instance of application. It removes the gap between understanding and execution. It closes the distance between intention and behavior. And when this gap is closed, the discipline becomes identity. The mind no longer practices the pause, it operates through it. There is no decision to apply it, no reminder needed. It is embedded into the structure of thought itself. Every impression is automatically delayed, examined, and filtered. At this point, failure becomes difficult. Not because the mind is perfect, but because the system prevents most errors from forming. The conditions that once produced distortion, speed, attachment, projection, inconsistency, have been systematically removed. What remains is controlled perception. And controlled perception is the foundation of all further clarity. The final failure is the most concealed. It does not appear as speed, or attachment, or distortion, or inconsistency. It appears as confidence. The mind, having practiced the discipline, begins to trust its own process. It assumes that because it now pauses, examines, and controls, its conclusions are therefore reliable. This is where the last vulnerability emerges. The discipline of paused evaluation is not a guarantee of correctness. It is a reduction of error. But the mind, once structured, begins to overestimate its own accuracy. It replaces impulsive certainty with disciplined certainty, and fails to see that certainty itself remains the risk. No process eliminates limitation. Even a controlled mind operates within constraints, limited information, incomplete context, finite perspective. The pause can filter, examine, and refine, but it cannot access what is absent. And yet, the mind begins to act as if it can. This creates a new form of blindness. Not the blindness of haste, but the blindness of overconfidence. The mind no longer rushes, but it concludes too firmly once it does conclude. It forgets that discipline improves the process, not the scope of knowledge itself. The correction here is precise. The mind must apply the same discipline not only to impressions, but to its own conclusions about its performance. It must ask, even after examination, what might still be missing? Without this question, the system closes prematurely. Closure is the final error. Because closure ends observation. Once the mind believes it has arrived, it stops looking. It stops testing. It stops adjusting. And in that stillness, unnoticed inaccuracies remain fixed. The discipline of paused evaluation must therefore remain open-ended. Not unresolved, but unfinalized. A conclusion is reached, but never sealed. It is used, but not protected. It guides action, but does not define reality. This distinction preserves flexibility at the highest level of thinking. Most cannot sustain this. They seek certainty as an endpoint. They want a position that does not move, a conclusion that does not change. But reality does not provide this. It is dynamic, layered, and often incomplete. Any fixed conclusion will eventually diverge from it. The disciplined mind anticipates this divergence. It builds revision into its structure. It expects that what is concluded now may require adjustment later. This expectation removes the need for defense. There is nothing to protect, only something to refine. This produces a different kind of confidence. Not confidence in being correct, but confidence in the ability to correct. The mind no longer relies on the stability of its conclusions, but on the reliability of its process. It trusts that if error appears, it will be detected and adjusted. This trust is grounded, not assumed. Because the process remains active. The pause is still present. The examination still occurs. The non-attachment still holds. And now, an additional layer is added, the refusal to finalize. This refusal is not hesitation. It is control over closure. The mind decides when to act, but it does not decide that its understanding is complete. It separates action from certainty. One can act on the best available judgment while still recognizing that the judgment is provisional. This separation is essential. Without it, the mind delays action in search of impossible certainty, or acts prematurely under false certainty. The discipline avoids both extremes. It allows action without illusion. And this leads to the final structure. Perception is filtered. Judgment is delayed. Attachment is removed. Source is examined. Consistency is maintained. And certainty is withheld. Nothing is accepted without inspection. Nothing is held without flexibility. Nothing is concluded without awareness of limitation. This is not a method applied occasionally. It is a system that governs all thought. And when fully established, the mind no longer seeks to eliminate error completely. It seeks to remain capable of detecting it. It does not attempt to become infallible. It becomes responsive. Because infallibility is impossible, but responsiveness is not. The discipline of paused evaluation, in its final form, is not about arriving at perfect judgment. It is about never allowing judgment to escape examination, not at the beginning, not in the middle, and not at the end. The process does not stop. The discipline of paused evaluation is not a single act, but a continuous structure imposed on thought. It begins by interrupting immediacy, but it does not end there. It extends through every layer: how impressions are received, how judgments are formed, how conclusions are held, and how certainty is restrained. Without this discipline, the mind is governed by speed, shaped by distortion, and stabilized by false certainty. With it, the mind becomes ordered, deliberate, and resistant to its own errors. But this control is not permanent. It does not sustain itself. The moment the pause is abandoned, the previous patterns return: immediacy, attachment, assumption. There is no neutral state. So the requirement is constant enforcement. Every impression must be delayed. Every judgment must be examined. Every conclusion must remain open. Because the moment evaluation stops, error begins.